So my name's Russ Cohen. I am a Middlesex County native. I was born in Norfolk County. I was born in Brookline, but shortly thereafter, coming home from the maternity ward, I lived in Newton Highlands, and then when I was 7.5, I moved to Weston, and then went off to college and came back and settled in Cambridge, and then eventually moved to Arlington, where I live now. But my mom is still in Weston, and my edible native plant nursery is partially in Weston. We'll talk more about that later in the show. So, and let me just say how grateful I am to the Conservation District for their plant sale emphasizing native plants, because that's what I'm all about too, and I'll get to that later in the program. But in the meantime, before I do any talking, I'm just gonna skip ahead here, see if I can get this to work. All right, so before I start talking about plants, I want to acknowledge the fact that much of the information I'm sharing with you tonight is information that the indigenous inhabitants of this region figured out in the thousands of years they were inhabiting this area and relying on foraging for a large portion of the food and medicine and stuff they relied upon. So, so I'm really grateful that that information has trickled down to me and that I'm able to share it with you tonight. And if I were to point you, let me try again with my there it goes. All right, great. So if I were to point you to a great source of information about indigenous relationship to plants, it's this book, Braiding Sweetgrass, with Robin Wall Kimmer, who I've had the great fortune to spend some personal time with. And this is a terrific book. I assume some of you haven't read it yet. And if you haven't, I urge you to do so. And you might say, okay, Russ, I'll read it, but you should see this stand of books at my nightstand. It's like this tall. Yeah, I could put it at the bottom. Maybe a couple of years later, I'd get to it. I understand. My nightstand's the same way. But here's a suggestion for you. You might want to have this book cut in line just to read this one chapter. Oh, this is our most recent book, which is also worth reading. And the chapter is called The Honorable Harvest. It's actually in both books. These principles are in both books. And here's a list that Robin has put together, and I liken this. This is almost like the 10 Commandments of foraging. And she suggests that people might even want to make a laminated card with this information on it and take it out to the woods as they're thinking about, okay, I see this edible wild plant. Is it appropriate for me to pick it, and how much can I pick, and who should I share it with? How do I tend this plot? How do I respect the needs of the animals and other organisms that might need this plant, and stuff like that. So, it turns out that a lot of these principles, we describe them in modern terms today, we'd call them ecological. But my understanding is that a lot of indigenous language don't even have words for ecology and conservation and stuff like that because it was so embedded in the culture. What do you need a word for that? That's what we do, that's who we are. So anyway, so this is particularly important for native species. So native plants often have important roles in the ecosystem. Animals rely upon them for food or some other important portion of their life cycle. So if you are gathering native plants in the wild, I encourage you to use some forbearance and restraint just to make sure that you don't upset the ecological balance in any way. But depending upon the part of the plant you're harvesting, there are going to be different impacts. For example, picking berries and nuts, those are relatively benign foraging activities because all you're doing is gathering the seed dispersal portion of the organism. There's often a lot of those around. But if you are digging plants up to harvest them or stripping all the flowers or all the leaves of plants to harvest them, you can imagine that could be a lot more traumatic for the plant. So keep that in mind. All right, so that's for native plants. But when I'm out in the landscape thinking about what I want to nibble on, there's lots of other stuff too, and I'm going to talk about them in my show tonight. So invasive plants, we heard about their discussion in another context earlier tonight, and that's obviously very, very important. So much so that this is a guidebook that the state put out with a couple nonprofit partners a little over 20 years ago to educate people about invasive plants. The main bad thing that invasive plants do is they usurp the habitat of the native species. They take it away from them. So ecologically, they're very disruptive. So this guidebook covers 66 of what are considered to be the most ecologically disruptive non-native plants that can be found in Massachusetts. And so, as I said, ecologically, they're bad news, but if there is a silver lining to the native cloud, the invasive cloud, perhaps it's the fact that some of these plants are edible. In fact, out of the 66 species covered in this book, at least 20 of them are edible. And as far as most ecologists are concerned, they'd be thrilled if you picked to nate as many of those as you possibly could. I'm totally serious about this. This is guilt-free foraging. You cannot pick too many invasive species, provided that you're not spreading them around in the process. You don't want to do that, but that's easily avoidable. edible. So here's some of my favorite invasive edibles, and I'm going to talk about several this show. So over here, I have some sour cream knotweed crumb cake available for you to try at the end of the talk. And for right now, I have some autumn olive fruit leathers. So I'm going to tell you about this later in the show. So feel free to take a piece and pass it around. And so this is what it looks like. And so it's called autumn olive because that's what the fruit looks like in the fall. And if you thought that was Russian olive, you're actually incorrect. Russian olive is a close relative of this plant, but the fruit is more of a grayish brownish color. So if you're seeing fruit that's red, that's actually autumn olive. So definitely an invasive species in Massachusetts. I hope you'll discover, as I think, it's quite tasty. So anyway, I'll tell you how I make this fruit leather at the end of the talk. So these, what I'm going to teach you in the slideshow is plants that are organized chronologically by foraging opportunity. And that's just how I think of plants out there. But I will mention when there's a native species that you might consider propagating yourself or planting in your yard, I will talk about that too. All right, so let's start with this one. Okay, now everybody knows these are fiddleheads. That is not enough to know that this is going to be a yummy, edible fiddlehead. In fact, out of all the ferns I know of, and almost all go through this stage in the spring where they're all curled up like that, I only know of two that taste good and only one that's safe to eat in quantity, and that's this one. This is the ostrich fern. This is the quote-unquote fiddlehead fern, the kind you see for sale in the stores and the fancy restaurants and stuff like that. And by the way, as far as I know, nobody is farming fiddleheads. And so when you see a fiddlehead in a store or in a restaurant, it was gathered from the wild, and that's not inherently bad. You know, I forage all the time. I encourage other people to do that. It's just the way that it's done by some of the folks that are picking to supply the market for fiddleheads, is they get a little carried away and they pick more than they should for ecological purposes. So you see, that's pretty typical appearance of a clump of ostrich fern fiddleheads like that. And so my advice is just to confine your foraging to just one or two of the curled up parts per clump. Let the rest grow out. That's a totally sustainable level of harvest. Unfortunately, what some of the people do picking to convert the plants to cash is they go into the fiddlehead patch, they'll pick every single fern they see. And that can actually kill the plant by harvesting it so hard. So 1 or 2 per clump, totally sustainable level of harvest. So in here, I don't have time to dwell on this very much, but there are 5 different ways to distinguish the ostrich fern from any other kind of fern. So if you see all 5 things, you know for absolute sure it's the ostrich fern. So when they come up in a vase-shaped clump. You can see that. If you cut the stems in cross-section, it makes a U shape like a celery stalk. On the curled up part are these brown papery scales that come off really easily with your fingers, so it's not like the wool on a cinnamon fern. And to get back to indigenous culture, so sometimes in indigenous languages, there are really cool practical details about plants in there. And I learned this from a ethnobotanist who's actually from the Pacific Northwest, but I learned from her that the Maliseet tribe, whose homeland straddles what we now call Maine and New Brunswick, that the word they use for the ostrich fern fiddlehead, masos, is the same exact word they use to describe the circling motion a dog makes before it lies down. And when I heard that, I thought, oh yeah, I can see the resemblance, yeah. So that's what you get when you inhabit an area for thousands of years and you're just keen observers of what's going on and paying attention to similarities and patterns and stuff. Okay, so the real place where you're gonna encounter ostrich ferns in the wild is alluvial floodplain soil. And pre-colonization, Eastern Massachusetts had a lot of it all over the place. And then we came in and said, oh, this is fertile bottomland. I can, put in my, my cornfields here and stuff like that. And of course, indigenous people did a fair amount of that too, but so there are little remnants of this habitat in Middlesex County, for example, along the Assabet River in Concord. I could have taken this photo there. This is actually along the Connecticut River I think it was in Sunderland, Mass. So that's that very silty alluvial floodplain soil. That's where you're gonna encounter it in the wild, but it also grows in people's yards, and I'll talk about that in a second too. So now you can really see the vase-shaped clump when these ferns unroll like that. And the 5th thing to look for are these guys right here. Oh, I can't get my pointer to work on the screen. But if you see the white arrows there are these fertile fronds, the spore-bearing fronds that get about 9 or 10 inches tall, and they're green in the spring, but the ones that carried over through the winter when the fiddleheads are coming up, they'll be brown. And if you cut their stems in cross section, they also form that U shape. So if you're seeing all 5 of those things, you know for absolutely sure it's the ostrich fern. Now, if you've ever bought ostrich ferns at the store and cooked them up and been not very impressed with them, you might want to try this technique, which is amply demonstrated by this naturalist, Beth Basler, who took a bunch of us to a patch of fiddleheads growing along the Connecticut River in Northfield, and she brought her camp stove with her to the fiddlehead patch, and we were eating those fiddleheads 10 minutes after we picked them, and they were truly exquisite that way. Okay, so here, I mean, besides eating them, some people plant ostrich ferns, I think, having no clue that they're actually edible, but just like the way they look. So here's a yard in Lexington where some folks said, oh, you know, let's grow some fiddleheads just right on the edge of our house lot. And these are plants that will spread naturally through their root system. So if you put a couple in and they're happy, eventually you'll get more and more and it will fill out an area. So it's a very handsome plant. And I don't know this for sure, but I'm pretty confident these homeowners have no clue this is actually the fiddlehead fern. All right, so here's a plant I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, stinging nettle. And if you've never been stung by stinging nettle, it's not like poison ivy where you find out a day or two later you got into it. You get stung by stinging nettle, you know right away. But the good news is the sting rarely lasts for more than an hour, and there are antidotes. So I'm going to show you an antidote in just a few minutes. So this is a wonderfully edible plant. This is usually the first species I'm gathering, first or second week in April. And this is the stage I'm gathering it when it's only about 6 inches tall. And what I will do is just with some I can actually do this with my bare fingers, but if you're a novice at this, you might want to wear gloves or just use some scissors. And you're just taking the top inch or two off of each plant and then throw that into your bag, bring that home, dump it into a bowl of water, stir it around, give it a good wash. And then you take some tongs, you're really not touching it. You're taking some tongs, you're flinging the cooked nettle tops into a pot like that. And then you steam them in more or less the water that's still clinging to the plants in the washing process, and they'll shrink quite a bit, but after about 6 minutes, they're completely done. And this cooking method converts the chemical that would have caused a sting in the raw plant into a protein. So it makes the plants about 7% protein, which is pretty high for a leafy green vegetable. Plus, nettles have all kinds of other vitamins in them and minerals like calcium. It's the closest thing I know of to a vitamin pill in the plant world. It's really good for you. So after you've steamed the nettle greens like this, you could eat them just plain if you wanted to. I think the flavor is kind of like split peas, or you can incorporate them into different dishes. So here's cream of stinging nettle soup. This is a recipe from my book. Sounds like something they might have made in the old Addams Family TV show. And it's quite simple. It's just the steamed nettle greens thrown into a blender with the sauteed potatoes and onions and just some chicken stock and half, and it's quite good. And then these stinging nettle balls. So this is the spinach ball recipe from the 1950s. We're using Pepperidge Farm stuffing mix to hold it all together. And you just substitute the steamed nettle tops for the spinach. The recipe works really good. Very easy to make. Okay, anybody know what this plant is? It is a mint, yes, very good. And one of the things that mint plants tend to have in common is they have stems that are 4 equal sides to them. So if you cut them in cross section, it forms a square. And also the leaves grow opposite from each other on the little stems. And so this is catnip. And catnip does grow wild. I've seen it grow wild in Waltham. And it does have the opposite effect on people that it has on cats. It's a sedative. It's a tranquilizer. So people would drink catnip tea to relax after a stressful day. And you could use the leaves fresh or dried either way. Okay, so here's curled or curly dock. This is one of the antidotes to the stinging nettle. And so in the spring, when the leaves are young, you can scrunch them up and get the juice out and then apply that to your skin where you've been stung. Or even better, if you search at the base of the plant, sometimes you can find some gooey stuff that's almost like aloe vera gel. And if you can find that and put that on your skin, it's like instant relief. So this is also edible plant. At this stage, what I'll do is pull out the tender leaves from the center of the plant, bring them home, get a pot of water boiling in the stove, throw the leaves in there, and I'll blanch them as I'll cook them for 20 seconds. That's it. And I'm just taking any residual bitterness away from them. And then you can use it just like cooked spinach. So spanakopita, the Greek spinach pie with the phyllo dough and the feta cheese, the blanched dock leaves work really well as a substitute for the spinach in that recipe, as do the stinging nettle greens, by the way. Okay, so talk about invasive species. This one's at or near the top of the invasive blacklist. This could be one of the most hated species on Earth. And it is, And it is very ecologically disruptive, and once it gets established, it's very hard to snuff it out. And so there's a whole chapter on knotweed in my book, and the subtitle of the chapter is, "If you can't beat it, eat it." Now, I've never claimed, because I don't believe it's true, that you can control this one or any other invasive species by eating them. I don't think that could possibly work. But my attitude about invasive plants is that, if, the conservation district group says, we've got invasives pushing into this area, this otherwise intact plant community, and it's going to really be ecologically disruptive. We got to get in there with the hammer and tongs and get it out of there. I get out of their way, and I encourage everybody else to get out of their way. But these plants are so ubiquitous in our landscape that even with all that control activity going on, there's plenty still around. So you'll have plenty of opportunities to, not, have to worry about, oh, my favorite knotweed patch, they're taking it out. There's only 100 more around, so you'll be fine. Anyway, and another thing is, plants like knotweed that thrive in disturbance, whether it's natural or human caused, so they can tolerate, some pretty contaminated areas. So like I wouldn't harvest knotweed growing next to the dumpster by the auto body shop. Okay, so, and that's a general principle, is I don't forage in places like that. So, but I found knotweed in places that are quite far away from, traffic, from pollution, where I feel fine about harvesting it. Okay, so, as you know, this time of year, it's all looking like bamboo. It's about 8 or 9 feet tall. You see these reddish brown stalks, maybe with a few seeds still on there. And this plant's an herbaceous perennial, so that's telling you where it's going to pop up next April, where those dried stalks are. So that's when to go, like second, third week of April, go to that spot. And in the midst of all those dried stalks, you'll see a little shoot, like what you see in the left there, green with leaves clustered at the top and little red dots on it. So that's the wild asparagus stage. What you could do at that point is just snap it off or cut it ground level, then just steam it for a few minutes and eat it hot or cold like asparagus. But my favorite stage to eat this plant is what I call the wild rhubarb stage, when the stalks get about 1.5 feet, 2 feet tall. So imagine this is ground level, top of the stalk is there, so I'm just cutting it right there. Then I have a length of stalk about that long. So what I do with it next is I peel the skin off, because the skin is kind of stringy, and get caught in your teeth. But, it's not poisonous or anything. You absolutely eat a knotweed stalk with the skin on. I just like, if I'm going to use it in baking, which is what I usually do, I trim that off. But you can see the knotweed stalks are hollow, so you don't want to peel too deeply, or all you've left is the hole. You just want to get that very outer layer off. And then you've got this crisp green tube, which you can eat right on the spot if you want. It's tart and juicy, kind of like a Granny Smith apple, or you can chop it up, as I've done in the bowl here, and use it instead of rhubarb in virtually any recipe calling for rhubarb, because Japanese knotweed and rhubarb are related plants with very similar flavors. So here is my strawberry knotweed pie. The recipe's in my book, and virtually everybody I fed this pie to say, this is even better than strawberry rhubarb pie. All right, but you might be looking at that pie and say, all right, yeah, but I'm a little intimidated by pie crust, and that latticework top, I don't know if I can pull that off. So I'm going to show you a way to use those knotweed pieces, those hollow pieces, that requires no cooking skill whatsoever, is you could just use them as a little tart edible container and fill it with like a salmon mousse or flavored cream cheese. And then it's a delightful little thing to serve to company, and yeah, you don't need to know how to cook to do that. Okay, so one of the reasons why I have this sour cream knotweed crumb cake here is because a number of years ago, I was leading a walk. We saw some knotweed. I'm bragging about my pie. And this smart aleck in the group says, well, of course your pie tastes good. It's got strawberries in it. I said, all right, well, as you know, those of you that bake and use rhubarb, there's lots of yummy things you can do with rhubarb that don't involve strawberries whatsoever. So that's an example, what I have up here for it. Now, obviously, I didn't make this, by picking the knotweed now. The knotweed's in season in April and early May. And actually, what you need to do is harvest it and bake it then. Actually, when I make a pie, what I do is assemble the pie raw and freeze it. And then when I want to bake that pie, I thaw it out and then bake it. But for a coffee cake, you bake it all the way through and just freeze it. So I pulled that out of my freezer this morning. Okay, so when I give talks to garden clubs, which I do all the time, I ask them what this plant is, and everybody yells out phlox, and they're all wrong. So in case you were wondering the same thing. So all phlox family flowers have 5 petals. These flowers have 4 petals. This is actually an invasive species called Dame's rocket that was a garden plant and escaped from the garden, and it's actually making itself increasingly at home here in Middlesex County. And you see how it comes in a white color and a purpley color? That is almost always how you see it in the wild, the two colors together. So it makes it very easy to recognize, even at quite a distance. And the whole plant's edible, leaves, and even this time of year, if you could find it, you could eat it. But I tend to just eat the flowers because it's fun to eat flowers. And although the white flowers and the purpley flowers have the same flavor, I just tend to use the purple flowers because the purple is a funner color than white. So you just pick them off the plant, eat them just plain, throw them into salads, you decorate other foods with them, whatever you want. So once again, like the knotweed, total guilt-free foraging opportunity. All right, so there's some big hills in Middlesex County, but nothing like that big mountain in the background there. That's actually the presidential range in New Hampshire, Mount Washington, that's still snow on it over Memorial Day weekend. But the point of the photo is to talk to you about dandelions. Dandelions are probably responsible for turning more people off of eating wild plants than anything else. And the story usually goes something like this. It's the spring and you look out on your yard, you see all these dandelions blooming and you say to yourself, oh, I heard dandelions are edible. I should try them. So you go out to your yard, you pick a few leaves, you bring them indoors, you put a little oil and vinegar on them, you take one bite. It's incredibly bitter. You spit it out, you say, yuck, I'm never going to eat a wild plant again, which is a real shame because dandelions are great if you eat the right part at the right time. So what is that and when is that? Well, when I start seeing whole fields turning yellow with dandelion flowers, it's really too late unless you're going to eat the flowers, but the rest of the plant is going to be quite bitter. So what I do is harvest the plant before the flowers come out. It's actually the unopened flower buds, you see a whole bunch right there, that I consider the tastiest part of the plant. In fact, I consider dandelion flower buds to be among my favorite vegetables, period, cultivated or wild. The flavor is a cross between corn, spinach, Brussels sprouts, and artichokes. You can imagine all those together. And so to prepare them, you pick them off the plant and then you throw them in the bowl of water like I was doing with the nettle tops just to wash them off. Get a pot of water boiling on the stove, throw the dandelion buds in there and cook them for 60 seconds. That's all they need. And then they're done. You can add them to soups or omelets or casseroles. But before you do anything with them, before you even put any salt or butter on them, just try them plain. I think you'll be amazed at how good they are. And if you want to eat dandelion leaves, this is the time to do it. And so when I'm picking the buds off the plants, if I see some tender young leaves tucked into the base of the plants, I'll harvest them too, prepare them the same way. Okay, so yes? Yeah. Oh yeah, sure. Yeah, you can store them in the fridge. You can also blanch them and store them in the freezer. Yeah, they have a pretty long shelf life. Okay, so this photo is a little out of chronological sequence because this plant with the blue flowers blooms in the summer, but it's so closely related to dandelion, I dropped it in here. So this is chicory. You can see the leaves look really similar to dandelions. The flowers are blue, that's the big difference. And also the flowers are on these long stalks that are like 2 or 3 feet tall. And that's very different from dandelion. So if you ever see a plant that's got dandelion-like leaves and then this brown stalk coming out of the center of it, that's a chicory plant. But if you made a mistake and mixed the two up, they're absolutely identical in use and pretty much in flavor and stuff, so it's not a problem at all. So chicory flowers are edible. They don't have a lot of flavor, but blue is an unusual food color, so it's fun to just snip those petals off and get them into a salad just to enjoy that flavor. And then the leaves on chicory are edible in the cool weather, so when it gets hot, they get way too bitter. But probably when you hear chicory, you think about a drink. And yes, you can absolutely make a drink. Oh, let me just mention, there is a way of hiding the leaves from the sunlight to make them milder. So if you have it growing on your in your yard, you could just take a box and tip it over the plant and just have the leaves continue to grow in the absence of the sunlight. I'm sorry, I keep talking into this. And then it'll be like endive. So if you know what endive is actually cultivated form of chicory, they're very closely related plants. So, okay, now let's get to the chicory roots. Okay, now this is something that we couldn't do on a day like today because the ground is frozen, all right? But if we have a January thaw and the ground thaws up enough for you actually extract roots from the ground, you might want to consider doing this. I did it this fall, got all the chicory roots I needed. So, all right, to make the drink, what you do is you harvest the roots, and then you cut them into uniform sized pieces like I've done here, spread them out in a cookie sheet, and roast them for a couple hours, like about 325 degrees. And then they will turn brown and give off this very strong, very nice smell and get very brittle. And at that stage, you throw them into a food processor and you grind them up to make the grounds. Oh, I'm sorry. And then you brew beverage from that. And so I find that I only need about half the amount of chicory grounds to make the same strength beverage as coffee grounds. And whatever device you use to make coffee, your percolator, your French press, whatever, you can use the same exact device to make the chicory drink. And the drink that you make from the chicory roots does taste amazingly like coffee, especially if you usually drink your coffee with cream and sugar and you drink the chicory the same way. Flavor is really similar. The one big difference is there is no caffeine in chicory. So if you're one of these people who says, what's the point of drinking it if there's no caffeine in it, then chicory's just not going to cut it for you. Okay, now chickweed. Sometimes when we have a mild late fall, you can still find this on a December 8th. Not this year though, because we've just gotten very cold very fast. So it's not out now. Actually, I know one place where it's growing, but it's very scarce now compared to how it usually is. Very, very common farm and garden weed, and it's a cool weather weed. So this one has a spring season and a fall season. And I use it as a sprout substitute in a sandwich or lettuce substitute in a salad. It's quite good that way. So daisies are edible, including the flowers, but the tastiest part of a daisy plant is actually the leaves before the flowers open. So you need to be able to recognize the plant at that stage. So that's what it looks like at that stage. And I'm sorry this photo is a little out of focus, but if you see the flat flower top there in the center of the photo in the upper left, you see the flowers have a flat top and they have markings on it, kind of like the spokes of a bicycle wheel. So look for that. And then look for the leaves like this that are attached to the plants. Those are the oxeye daisy plants before the flowers bloom. And the leaves can be really yummy, so yummy that I've never cooked them. I just throw them right into a salad. Here's sheep sorrel, really common in Middlesex County because this is an acid soil indicator. So you don't even have to do a soil test. If you've got this, you know for sure you've got acidic soil. And it is a diminutive version of the French garden sorrel, so you can use it the same way. You can make a sorrel sauce from it, a sorrel soup from it, and so on. Here's a completely unrelated plant with the same flavor. Yes? Yeah. So I can't advise you how to get rid of it, but I can tell you that as long as it's there, you might as well enjoy it. So in the spring, it's going to look like that and be nice and tender. As the weather warms up, it's going to get more bitter and stringier and not as yummy, unless it's growing in the shade. If it's growing in the shade, it'll still look like this. Yes, you can eat it raw, you can eat it cooked. This is the one that's actually much more common because this is everywhere. This might even be a native species, this yellow wood sorrel. But I've never bothered to grow it because it does such a good job just growing pretty much anywhere it wants to on its own. And one nice thing about this one is a very long season availability. You can find it at this stage for months, like from May through November, like this. And any tender part of the plant's edible. So the flowers are edible, the leaves of the heart-shaped leaflets are edible. Even those things that look like miniature ears of corn, those are the seed capsules. They're tart and juicy. You can eat them too. Now, the chemical responsible for the sour flavor in this plant is a chemical called oxalic acid, which might not be good to eat in humongous amounts. Like if you ate a gigantic sailboat full of just either or both of these plants, it could inhibit your body's ability to uptake calcium, and it could irritate your stomach lining, but there's no reason to be unduly concerned about the chemical because it's present in a lot of conventional vegetables like beets and spinach and rhubarb. So as long as you eat it in moderation, you'll be okay. So, to go back to your question about how to control the sheep sorrel. So it occurred to me that if you lime, you raise the pH of your soil, you might make it so that the sheep sorrel isn't happy there anymore. That's what I would do. Right. So, so this is okay, as long as it's here, what use can I put of it? That's the theme of this talk. Oh, you can eat it? Oh, great. Okay, so here's two you can eat. Very closely related plants, very similar looking, hard to tell apart, but you don't need to. There's the peppergrass on the left side and the poor man's pepper on the right side. And the poor man's pepper on the right side, that's available for like a week and a half to 2 weeks in the mid to late spring. But the peppergrass, it's like wood sorrel. It's available for months on end. And that one actually might be a native species. I suspect it is Virginicum. When you see that name in the botanical name, it's probably native, but it certainly behaves like a weed, like all our weeds. So very common plant. It's a great plant to remember if, let's say, you've got company coming over for supper and they arrive early or they arrive on time, or the roast, whatever you're making for them isn't done yet, and they're starving and you need to feed them something. You can go out to your yard, find the peppergrass. You want to strip those flat, round seed pods off the plants, mix it with a little cream cheese, spread that on crackers, and feed that to them, and they'll love it, and they'll forget all about the fact that dinner isn't ready yet. Okay, and to illustrate a point, so I'm on a natural history program, somebody else's program down on Cape Cod a number of years ago, and so she's assembling these roast beef and boursin sandwiches for our lunch, and there was peppergrass plants growing all outside the building where she was making the sandwiches, and I told her, I said, why don't we add some of this peppergrass to the sandwiches? She said, yeah, let's do it. And it was great. Everybody loved it. Okay, so when I make stuff from wild ingredients, I'm not a purist about it. Like when I make a strawberry knotweed pie, I don't insist that every ingredient be wild. Like I don't have to use yak butter for the shortening. I could use regular butter, regular sugar. But you know, it is fun to make a salad just from wild ingredients, which is what this one is. But don't let me deter you from just throwing a few chicory flowers into a salad. You know, that's fine. You don't have to go extreme like I did here. Okay, so in this salad, I got mustard flowers. That's where those yellow flowers are. And I've got sheep sorrel and wood sorrel and chickweed and things like that bulking up the salad. And then the little red berries are partridge berries, and then the orangey berries are ground cherries. So there's partridge berries. These are pretty common in Middlesex County. You often see them under conifer trees. So partridge berries have virtually no flavor. So why eat them? Because they're pretty. So I'll put a few just on top of a salad just to get that red color in there. And then the ground cherries, so this is also chronologically out of sequence because this is more of a late summer, fall edible, because this is a member of the tomato family, the nightshade family. And as you know, those are plants that like the heat, so they don't really get going until, you know, midsummer. So this is a fruit that's enclosed in a calyx. That's a botanical term, but it's a husk that starts out green, as you see in the lower left part of the photo there, and then turns yellow, and then eventually turns brown, and then falls off the plant. So it's called ground cherry because the ripe fruit is actually off the plant, on the ground, underneath the plant. So when you look for it in late summer to the early fall, that's what you do. Look for the fruit inside the brown papery husk underneath the plant. Now the husk is important because there is a plant called horse nettle, which you might know. It's actually a native species, but it's a member of the nightshade family. It has poisonous yellow fruit. It's also a very thorny plant, but it could grow in the same place where the ground cherries grow. I don't worry about anybody getting poisoned from that plant because just because I wanted to be informed, I ate one just to, I tell people most poisonous plants taste really horrible, and this one tasted really horrible. So I really can't imagine anybody getting poisoned from horse nettle because they just take one bite and say, I've made a mistake here. But just remember, you can't see these fruit unless you take the papery husk off. So if you're looking at a plant, you see yellow tomato-like fruit on it, it's not the edible ground cherry. All right, so here's a plant that you might have discovered you got into when you get home and you find these burrs embedded in your socks or your dog's fur. And the guy who invented Velcro did get the idea from these burrs, by the way. It's appropriately enough called burdock. And it's a plant from Europe. It's a non-native, non-invasive plant, very, very common in a farm-type context. Some of the best places for harvesting this plant, right on the edges of the farm fields or school ball fields, stuff like that, where you can gather many plants in a short amount of time. So burdock is a biennial, so usually it has a 2-year life cycle. The first year, beginning of the second year, it looks like this. And by the way, if those leaves look like rhubarb, if you flip them upside down, they're quite woolly, and rhubarb leaves aren't. And also the petioles on these leaves are green or green streaked with a little purple, and they have ridges on them like a celery stalk. They're not smooth like a rhubarb stalk. So anyway, so one of the edible stages on a burdock is the root, and you want to harvest the root at the end of the first season, the beginning of the second season. That's when the max amount of food energy is in there. It's a very big root. Unfortunately, you can't grab the foliage and yank on it and get a burdock root out that way. It will break on you, so you have to dig them out, which is a lot of work. And I usually bother, and I pretty much guarantee that if you try to do it, your patience will give out before the root does, because they're very, very long. And so All right, so you're digging, and at some point you say, the heck with it. You sever what you got. Maybe you dug out that much root. It kept going. All right, so what do you do with the root at that stage? Very simple way to prepare it is just to wash it off. You don't have to peel it. Slice it into half-inch thick rounds and boil it in salted water until it's tender. About 15 minutes, it will taste like a starchy artichoke. It's related to artichokes, but I'm too lazy to do that. Instead, I'm harvesting the plant at this stage. This is the second year of growth, but it begins to send up that cylindrical flower stalk in the center of the plant. And I'm cutting that at ground level, lopping off the top cluster leaves. I have a length of stalk about that long. And you do have to peel them. So let me just show you. So all those, and this is in Worcester, Middlesex County, an old farm field, on the edge of the farm field. I carried all those burdock flower stalks in less than a half an hour. And so you do have to peel them because the outside of the burdock flower stalk is bitter and stringy, so you want to trim that off. But unlike the knotweed, they're solid all the way through. So after you take that outer part off, there's a lot of food left over. And so you cut that into half-inch thick rounds, boil that in salted water until it's tender, about 6 minutes. And it's a very nice vegetable, just plain, or it's really good thrown in spaghetti sauce, or it's really good in the recipe that I'm sure a lot of you have eaten. Maybe you've even made it yourself. It's a recipe. You usually take artichoke hearts and you mix it with Parmesan cheese and mayonnaise and breadcrumbs. You mix it all together. You bake it in the oven. It's a spread that you put on crackers where you can substitute the burdock flower stalk rounds for the artichoke hearts. In that recipe, it works really well. So there it is. It's very, very easy to make. Okay, so here's catbrier. Anybody that's done any bushwhacking knows this plant. And it is edible, believe it or not. In the spring into the summer, the tips of the growing vines are very soft and supple, so it's not woody at all. You can bend it with your fingers. You can just snap that bit. Even the thorns you can push in with your fingers. Just snap that off and pop it right in your mouth. And it has kind of a tart flavor. So this is Smilax rotundifolia, which means round-leaved. I'm going to show you the cousin of this plant I like even more, and that is carrion flower. So this is my wife, Ellen, with a cluster of carrion flower shoots we picked in Middlesex County. And you see how on the left, behind the live ones, you can see the dried stalks from last year's plant. So this is an herbaceous perennial, dies to the ground at the end of every growing season. But look at those shoots. Don't they look an awful lot like asparagus? You harvest them like asparagus. You prepare them like asparagus. They taste like asparagus. They're related to asparagus. So isn't that great? So why is it called carrion flower? So here we are on a camping trip. We're using a Frisbee as a plate here. We've got these steamed carrion flower shoots. And if you look carefully, you can see these little spherical ball-like things on there. Those are the flower buds. And about a week after we had harvested these plants, if we hadn't picked them, the flowers look like that. When you hold your nose up to that flower, that's when you discover why it's called carrion flower, because it smells like dirty gym socks and rotting meat. So if you encounter the plant when it's blooming, it can be a rather unpleasant experience, but if you harvest it before it's blooming, it can be quite tasty. Okay, so here is black locust, and it's the flowers that are edible. This is an invasive species in Massachusetts, so once again, a guilt-free foraging opportunity. And I don't want you to be deterred by the fact that there's a bumblebee in the center of the photo. You might be saying, oh, bumblebee, that's a pollinator. I shouldn't be picking those flowers. I should leave it with the pollinators. Don't worry. Typical black locust tree is 30 or 40 feet tall, and when it's blooming, it's got thousands of blossoms on there. Let the bumblebees fly up a little higher. They can visit the flowers like above your head, and the ones that you can reach from ground level, you can harvest those. They smell like jasmine. They taste like sweet pea pods, so they're really fun to eat. This is around third week of May is when you want to harvest these. And so you strip them off their central stalks, and then you got a bowl of them there, and you could just add those to salads, eat them just plain like that if you wanted to. What I like to do is make fritters from them. The recipe's in my book, Black Locust Fritters. It's really good. So that's something to look forward to next spring. Okay, and pokeweed is available at the same time. Pokeweed's another herbaceous perennial, and there's the pokeweed shoot. And this one you have to boil for 7 minutes to make it safe because it has a minute amount of a purgative called phytolactin in it, which in small amounts it's not harmful, but in large amounts it's going to make everything on the inside of your body want to get to the outside of your body through every available means as quickly as possible. So that would be pretty nasty. So yeah, so the mature plants like the tall, when they get to be this tall, the stems, the leaves, the flowers, the shoots, the fruit, none of that stuff is edible, okay? It's only the shoot in the spring when it looks like that. You might be saying to yourself, okay, and it's quite good. You might say to yourself, all right, but I don't see anything really distinguished about that pokeweed shoot. How would I know that that's pokeweed? Well, here's the big favor the plant does for you. So as you know, cold weather, the plants have died back for the season, but they don't rot away. Those stems will persist through the winter into the following spring, whoops, and they'll still be there following spring when the shoots are coming up. You see last year's pokeweed plant going into the ground where this year's shoots are coming up. So that's how you know those shoots are pokeweed shoots, because you can see last year's plants, where last year's plants were. All right. Okay, so milkweed, so there's a chapter on pokeweed in my book, there's a chapter on milkweed in my book, and it's the same cooking method you use for both these species. So whatever part of the milkweed that you're harvesting, you boil it for 7 minutes, and that makes it totally safe to eat. And okay, native species, important ecological role, we'll get to that in a second. So there's at least 4 edible stages to eat on a milkweed plant, and they happen chronologically in succession. So if you mess up and miss a stage, you just wait a while till the next edible stage develops. So this is actually edible stage number 3. These flower buds, when they're in a nice tight green cluster, pick them off the plant, boil them for 7 minutes, and then you can eat them just plain or incorporate them into other dishes. So those milkweed flower buds in that bowl to the right there, those have been boiled for 7 minutes. Look how well they held up. If anything, they look even nicer than they did when they were attached to the plant. So you can eat them just as a side dish, just like that. Or in my book, I've got a recipe for milkweed egg puff, which is like a cross between a souffle and a casserole, and that's a good way to use them. And even the pods, when they're 1 inch long, you can boil them for 7 minutes, and the texture and the flavor is very similar to green beans. All right, but there is the monarch butterfly caterpillar to remind us how important anything in the Asclepius genus is for them to lay the eggs on, and for the caterpillars to eat the leaves and so on. And by the way, I should mention that it's only the common milkweed that's edible by people. So all the other species, butterfly weed, swamp milkweed, none of those are edible by people. It's just a common milkweed. So you might be saying to yourself, okay, I know, but I can't eat a milkweed plant. The monarchs, the monarch. I totally understand your concern, and it is something to be concerned about. I'm going to give you 2 coping mechanisms if you're one of those people. One is, you may know about this already, there's a great citizen science website called Journey North that plots the northward migration of the monarch butterflies from the wintering grounds in Mexico every spring. So in the winter, you're starting out with this outline map in North America with nothing going on. And then you see these little red dots as the butterflies begin the migration. They go to northern Mexico, Gulf of Mexico, the Midwest, and then eventually get to New England. And so just check that map periodically. And when you see the first dots reaching Massachusetts, say, okay, now they're here. Now they may want the milkweed around. But until then, there's no monarchs around, so you could just harvest what you want. And those of you that know that have harvested milkweeds or dealt with milkweed plants whatsoever, especially the common milkweed, it's a very robust plant. You chop it down, it's setting another shoot out right away. So you don't have to worry about extirpating it. Okay, so that's... So they lay, the female butterflies lay the eggs on the stems or the leaves, and then the caterpillars are eating, basically they can eat any part of the plant, but mostly they're eating the leaves. Okay, so the pods don't really have an important role in the butterfly's life cycle, so that's another coping mechanism you could do is if you're just harvesting the young pods, that's not really going to affect the butterfly. So, but what I do is I actively propagate this plant in my nursery, and I grow it out in a lot of the sites I'm doing planting at. And a very simple thing that you could do, it's too late for this now, but typically in the fall, there's a time probably about a month ago when those pods turn brown and split open and all the parachuting business begins to show. As you're traveling around, like one place where there's a ton of these, you might know, I can't remember the name of the road, but it's a road that goes from Route 2 into Concord Center that goes past the district court, and there's a big community garden on the left side. It's an enormous patch of milkweed plants there. And so you could just, when you're going past there, just gather up a couple of the pods, throw them in a plastic bag, just keep them in your car. And as you're traveling around, you see some good habitat for milkweed plants that doesn't have any, like bike path, school ball field, something like that. Just release the parachutes and help start a new colony. Okay, but this is what I did. In addition to all that, this is what I did, is I let the milkweed plants grow in my own yard. So that and back there, that's my house. I still have that boat. I have a different car now. But anyway, we planted blueberries along our driveway, and the milkweed plant said, oh, we'd like to grow here too. And we said, that's fine. So we do have to put a net over our blueberries to get some. The birds still get plenty of berries, but this way we get some. But the monarch said, hey, we can access the milkweed leaves through these nets here. So they lay the eggs on there. And we know that because one day we went out and found this crystals attached to a hinge on our garage door. And it's great that it attached on the hinge. So when the door went up and down, the crystals just rode up and down, for a couple of weeks until one day we went out and the crystals was clear because the butterfly had metamorphosed and flown away. So yeah, so you can walk the walk on your own land by introducing native plants to help balance out your foraging. Yes. If you boil the plants for 7 minutes, yeah, there's a whole chapter in my book on milkweed. So it's a really yummy plant. Yeah, right. Well, supposedly they're concentrating the bitterness in the milkweed plant. Yes, that's right. But I even somebody as sainted as Doug Tallamy would say, oh, that makes them poisonous to people. And I sent him an article that a lepidopterist, a butterfly expert at Cornell had written about how he cooks up milkweed and shares it with his family and they all love it. And so Doug said, okay, I'm not gonna say that anymore in my talks. So indigenous people ate milkweed too. So this is not something new that we discovered. Okay, all right, so talk about indigenous people. So this is a plant that has a long heritage of indigenous use, including to the present day, plant that's very popular among many of the tribes I interact with. And so an exceedingly easy plant to recognize because it's got leaves with 3 different shapes, no thumbs, 1 thumb, and 2 thumbs, all in the same plant. It's the only plant that does that. And in this time of year, you can even recognize it because it has green twigs. And if you scratch and sniff the green twigs, you're going to get a lemony smell. And so you can even spot sassafras in the winter that way. So, all right. So you may be familiar with this plant from sassafras tea or using the roots. The roots have that very familiar root beer flavor, and it's in the bark of the roots. And in my book, I've got a recipe for sassafras candy, which is like the root beer barrels you used to buy at the penny candy store, only even better because there's little bits of root bark embedded in the candy. It's very strong. Now, having said that, the Food and Drug Administration thinks that saffrol, which is an essential oil that's in the sassafras root bark, is carcinogenic, and so they ban saffrol-containing sassafras root products in the food supply. That ban's been in effect for over 60 years. And, but people like me that teach this plant, we've tried to find even anecdotal evidence of humans getting cancer from this plant. It turns out that the studies that the FDA based their decision on were based on rats. And as useful as rats are to try and figure out what might be harmful to us, their digestive systems aren't 100% the same as ours. And there's stuff that they can eat that we can't and vice versa. So it's very possible that humans can safely metabolize saffrol without a problem. And there's saffrol and cinnamon and nutmeg. And so a cynical person might say, well, the sassafras lobby wasn't strong enough to fight off the government regulators when they gave it that status. So, but if all you need to hear is, okay, FDA says saffrol carcinogenic, it's in sassafras roots, you say, okay, I'm not eating it. I totally support you in that. In fact, I totally support you wherever your comfort level is on anything I talk about tonight. Whether I'm not sure this is the right plant, it might be making a mistake, or I'm not sure this is a clean area, it might be contaminated, I don't want to be eating contaminants, and you chicken out, you don't pick something. I think that's perfectly sensible. All right, there is another part of the plant though where saffrol is not an issue, and that's the young leaves. So young sassafras leaves are used to make filet powder. You ever heard of filet powder? Filet powder is dried powdered sassafras leaves. And so you can make it yourself. I think it's best when you gather the young leaves and you just dry them and you pulverize them, and then you put that powder into a salt and pepper type shaker and then add it to your food near the end to flavor and thicken it. Okay, so there's a whole chapter in my book on cattails. I won't spend a lot of time on that. I'll just talk about a couple of the parts. So in the spring, this would be like first or second week of June in Massachusetts. The plants you'll see this swelling near the top of the stalk, and that's the immature bloom spike. And if you peel the outer leaves away, this is what you see inside. And you boil these up, and then the flesh on the flower, it's like a cross between corn and artichokes. It's quite good. And then at the same time, you can feel with the stalk that was supporting that immature bloom spike. That stalk, once you peel the outer leaves away, gets very flobby. It's not rigid at all. And then it's quite good. It's like hearts of palm or cucumber. And then even the pollen, cattail pollen, it's hypoallergenic, by the way, but you can just water the cattail marsh with a bag and just take the top of the flower, the male flower, and give it a shake, and this big cloud of yellow pollen comes off. And keep doing that, and after a while, you have a couple more of the pollen, and just put it through a fine mesh sieve to intercept any beetles or twigs or whatever got in there, and then you add the pollen to flour to make these very gorgeous and very nutritious cattail pollen muffins and crepes and other baked products. Okay, so here's a plant that looks a lot like cattail. It's actually not related at all. It's called Calamus or sweet flag, and there is an indigenous native version and a European version. They both occur here, and they're a little hard to tell apart. I can't remember exactly how. In my nursery, I'm just getting the sweet flag from folks that know how to tell the difference, so I'm confident what I'm planting is the native one. And so this is a plant with a very gingery flavor, and it's so much so that it's almost too strong, but in the spring when the shoots come out, you peel the outer leaves away, and the inner part is yellowish and very tender and mild, and that's nice to chop that up and add that to a salad to get a gingery flavor in there. Okay, burdock we already covered, so sorry this is appearing twice. Get that out of there. Okay, all right, so linden, there are American lindens and European lindens, genus Tilia. So American linden would also be called basswood, Tilia americana, and then the most common non-native linden we have here is the Tilia cordata, which is the little leaf linden. For forager, you don't need to know how to tell them apart because they're edible the exact same way. So the leaves in the spring, when they first come out, they're very soft and glossy and very tender and mild and nice to just eat right off the tree or put into salads. Or you can do what they do with these in England, where they call these lime trees, and they make lime sandwiches, which are like watercress sandwiches on the white bread with the crust cut off. And they just layer the young linden leaves in there as the filling for the sandwich. So this is actually showing you the second edible stage of the plant. And this is about the first day of summer is when to look for these. When the plants are blooming, they give off this wonderful lemon honey fragrance that in neighborhoods where the little leaf linden is used a lot as a street tree, like certain sections of the Back Bay, you don't even have to have your windows rolled down. It comes in just through your ear vents in your car, just wonderful smell. And so you make tea from these flowers, and you can use the flowers fresh or dried and drink the tea hot or iced. It's good all those ways. And besides tasting really good, it also has at least 2 medicinal values. It's soothing to your digestive system and your mental state at the same time. So herbalists really love to recommend linden tea to their clients. Okay, so here's another plant with a flower that you want to pay attention to, not to eat, but to do 2 things. The most important thing for most people is to see where the plant is growing and remember where it is to go back and pick the berries later. But of course, the name shadbush is an indication of the fact that something called phenology, we were paying attention to the timing of natural phenomena. It turns out that there's a pretty strong correlation between when this plant is blooming and when the anadromous fish like shad are running upstream in the rivers to spawn. And so for indigenous people, this very important clue that they could see, okay, shadbush is blooming, let's head to the river, get the fish. So, but for you, you might want to say, hey, there's the shadbush blooming when it really stands out in April because not much is happening then. It's a very early blooming plant. It blooms the same time as a plant that you may know Doug Tallamy hates with a passion, and that's the Callery of Bradford pear, which got planted a lot because it's early bloomer. This blooms the exact same time. There's no reason to plant a Bradford or Callery pear. Plant this one instead. And okay, so the fruit's called Juneberry because it's ripe in June in southern New England. In northern New England, it really should be called Julyberry, but here it's Juneberry. And there'll be the first day of summer. It's a good time to look for it. And these fruits, you can see they look a lot like blueberries, but they really don't taste like blueberries. They taste like a cross between cherries and almonds. And it turns out they're related to cherries and almonds. They're all related plants in the rose family. So there's a great plant for stuffing your face right by the tree. And now this there are at least 8 species that are native to New England, and they hybridize, so it's sometimes very hard to tell them apart. But all the fruit's edible, so you don't need to know what species it is. You just need to know genus Amalanth, you're all set. So, and while there are a lot of wild plants, this is probably among our most frequently planted woody native species in parks and other landscaped areas, probably because of that early blooming that it does. And so some of the best foraging opportunities are not in the wild, but in a public park. Like, for example, this is Paul Revere Park in Charlestown. So this is a DCR property that's right near the North Washington Street Bridge. So I used to work on Causeway Street. So my lunch hour, late spring, early summer, I just walk over to Charlestown. I'd be able to pick a quart or more of fruit on my lunch hour. And now most of these I would eat or share with other people, but I would also grow plants from them. And I think I have some slides about that. But let me start with mulberries that are also ripe at the same time. And I like to mix mulberries and Juneberries together to make strudel like you see in this photo. And yes, okay. So one thing I haven't talked about yet is the fact that since I retired from my day job with the Mass Fish and Game Department in the year 2015, I'm playing the role of Johnny Appleseed for native edible species. And I've set up a nursery, which is in Weston. And now I've got a new facility in Lincoln, where I'm propagating over 1,000 plants, most of which I grew from seed that I gather myself like this. And then I grow out these plants, and I work out arrangements with cities and towns, state and federal agencies, schools and colleges, tribes, organic farms, and others to plant plants in my nursery in appropriate places and their properties. And I'll talk more about this a little bit later in the show. But Juneberry is one that I've grown just from gathering seeds at Paul Revere Park. You pick the fruit and you withhold the temptation to chomp down on the seeds, which are very tasty, spit some into your hand, put those seeds in a little plastic bag, and then just store it in a fridge. And that's something called stratification, which is just a fancy word for winter. Most of our native seeds have evolved to need to go through an extended period of cold to break their dormancy. And so by keeping seeds in the fridge, you're basically doing that. And so, but sometimes the little timers go off and in the middle of the winter, they figure, hey, I've been in here a long time. It must be spring by now. So they start sprouting in the dark in their little plastic bags. So if that happens, you have to sow them right away. So you find a sunny windowsill or someplace to sow them and then grow them indoors until weather is nice to move them out. So I now have 3-foot-tall Juneberry plants in my nursery that I grew from seed that I gathered in this public park. And they're big enough now I can start to plant them out on my sites. Yeah, right. Yes. So it's a species that people like to plant in clumps because they're usually landscape architects and they're thinking visually about what's it going to look like. And that's less important when you're concerned about foraging. In foraging, you mainly want to make sure they get lots of sun. That's a general principle for fruit and nut trees. The more sun they get, the heavier they bear. There are some exceptions to that, like spice bush is an exception, but most plants, you want to get them as much sun as possible. Okay, sure, right. Yeah, but okay. So wild strawberry is a plant that just about anybody has space to grow. Even if you're in a condo, you could put a pot in your patio and grow it in that. And it's a diminutive little plant. It does fine in a lawn, doesn't mind getting mowed or stepped on. And it's got the pretty little flowers that the pollinators visit. And I guess there's a lot of Lepidoptera that also nibble on the leaves too. And the fruit, they're teeny. There's no getting around that, but they're very yummy. And those are fun too. And you make tea from strawberry leaves when the leaves are fresh or thoroughly dried. Apparently when they're wilted, they're slightly toxic, but fresh or thoroughly dried is fine. And the tea that you make from the leaves does taste at least vaguely like the fruit, and it does have vitamin C in it. So if you felt a case of scurvy coming on, you could rush out and make yourself some strawberry leaf tea. Okay, so when I collect seed and I have some extra, I'm happy to share it with different groups. So this is an example of where I shared it with a girls' school, Miss Hall's school, which is out in Pittsfield, where they had a greenhouse on campus. And they were growing the little vegetable starts, like little broccolis and lettuces and stuff to sell to the homeowners for the gardens and stuff. And I said, well, why don't you grow wild strawberries the same way? So they did. So they would use these clamshells, like we're buying our fruit in anyway, put the growing medium in there, sprinkle the strawberry seeds in there, and then put it in the greenhouse. And they were able to grow plants big enough to sell them at the spring plant sale along with all the other stuff. And apparently they sold quite well. So violets, this is the native dooryard violet. This one also does really well in lawns. I think I took this picture in my lawn, and they can be very prolific. So strawberry leaves by weight are higher in vitamin C than carrots, vitamin A than carrots, and higher in vitamin C than oranges. So you can eat the leaves. After the flowers go by, the leaves aren't quite as good, but certainly while the flowers are out, you can eat the leaves, raw or cooked. And the flowers are edible, and they're fun to decorate other things. You can candy them and then use them to decorate other things like this black walnut cake. So, so I have so many violets in my backyard that I'm able to extract dozens of them, and you can't tell that I pulled out any. They'll just fill right back in. And so you can propagate this plant by seed, but also does so well vegetatively. So like all these pots just came out from my backyard, and and I can just keep doing this. So now it turns out that some of the people that want the violets for their planting projects could care less that people could eat them. They want them for the pollinators, because apparently this is a good, relatively early season source of food for a lot of our wild bumblebees. So that's why they wanted it. I'm happy to give it to them. Okay, so here's a flowering raspberry. This is a gorgeous plant that you might want to plant just to look at it, even if you never ate it. It's got these magenta flowers about 2 inches across. It's very showy for a rubus species. And they have these enormous maple-like leaves, which are nice. And the canes don't have any thorns. So, so this is a plant that could be really good. So there's the fruit, and the fruit is perfectly edible. It's a little on the dry side, so I'd have to say a regular red raspberry is probably better just because it's juicier, but these taste fine and perfectly edible. Okay, so now I'm gonna tell you a story about when I gathered seed on a day like today or tomorrow, really, really cold day in January. I was up in Guilford, New Hampshire at a place called Gunstock, which is a downhill ski area, but they also have a wonderful cross-country system there. And I'm skiing along in January with my wife, and it's a really cold day, and we're going along a brook, and I see that, and I said, I know what that is. Those are the mummified remains of last season's flowering raspberries. And I could also tell, if you look at the cane, you can see it's got kind of a shagginess to it, which is also diagnostic for that species. And so my wife is saying, I'm getting cold, let's go. Said, let's just take a second. So I threw the seeds in my backpack and took them home, and I said, I'm gonna try and grow plants from them. And I did. So I have a bunch of plants in my nursery that I grew while I was cross-country skiing. So, as a forager, I'm used to picking stuff all the time. But now that I'm gathering seed, I have this extra, I'm looking year-round, not just, during the growing season. Okay, so black raspberry, also native species. And the fun thing that it does during the wintertime is that the canes turn this purpley color. So it's actually red underneath with this white glaucous waxy covering, but the two colors together come out as purple. And so this might be worth adding to your yard just to enjoy some purple color there during the off season. Okay, daylilies, not a native species, but very edible. In fact, most of you probably eaten daylilies if you've ever eaten the Chinese food dishes, mushu or hot and sour soup. Those use dried daylily flowers, usually the recipes for those. So there is a caveat, I'll tell you this in a second, but I'll first tell you that the tubers are edible. They're about like this big, and each plant will have like a dozen of them, and you can boil them, bake them, mash them, fry them. Most ways you use a potato. Then the shoots, they come up early in the spring because those tubers are early energy source. So those are edible. When they get a little taller, you can peel the outer leaves and eat the tender part like a scallion. And then the daylily buds, flower buds, the open flowers and wilted flowers are all edible. So the flower buds, you can saute in a skillet in butter for a few minutes and it'll taste like oniony green beans. The open flowers are edible. You could stuff them like a squash blossom or fry them in tempura batter. And then the wilted flowers you could add to soups to flavor and thicken them. So, oh, that's great. So why does it say with caution? Well, it turns out there's a chemical in daylilies that doesn't agree with some people's digestive systems. I think it's less than 20%. But if you're one of those people, you might find that you feel nauseous and or you have a loose bowel movement after you eat daylilies. You'll get better right away. You're not going to have flashbacks later on or anything, but you should just know that could possibly happen. It seems to be triggered most acutely by eating the raw tubers, but it's possible other parts of the plant could do it too. So just be cautious about that. And actually, there's a good opportunity to tell you that it's possible that you could be allergic to, have an idiosyncratic adverse reaction to some of these plants I'm talking about, where everybody else said, we eat a ton of it, and you yourself can't tolerate it for some reason, you have an allergy or something to it. So the standard advice is to not eat a huge amount of some new food you're trying for the first time, just to make sure that you don't break all out in hives or whatever. But if in general you're not allergic to conventional foods, it'd be very unlikely you'd be allergic to their wild counterparts, because chemically they're very similar. Okay, so jewelweed. Jewelweed that some people know is a remedy for poison ivy. Just scrunch it up and rub it on the place where you have poison ivy or where you think you're exposed to poison ivy. The seeds inside those jewelweed seed pods are edible. So if you look up there in the upper left-hand corner, you could see a seed pod where the angle between the seed pod and the plant is a sharp 90 degrees. And that's when the seeds inside that seed pod are edible. That's also when they'll detonate at the slightest touch. And so that's why this plant is called Touch Me Not, because if you wander through the jewelweed patch in the summer, the seeds start exploding on you. They just go all over the place. So if you want to eat those seeds, what you need to do is sneak up on one of those seed pods and grab it and have it explode in your hand. Don't worry, it won't hurt. So when you open up your hand, you'll see this mess. The C is like the springy bits. Letter D are the seeds that if you eat them, they taste just like store-bought English walnuts. So not like black walnuts, and I'm going to feed you a little bit later, but like store-bought English walnuts. And so it's fun to nibble on them. They're teeny, so you're not going to have a meal of them, but it's just a fun little nibble. Another cool thing you can do with those ripe seeds, and you don't need to do this to eat them, is if you gently rub that outer seed covering off, this inner seed color, letter E, is this beautiful bright blue robin's egg blue color, and I have no idea why that color is in there, because no creatures ever see it. It's just one of those unexplained mysteries of Mother Nature. Okay, so purslane, really common farm and garden weed, and likes the hot weather. And so this one's edible raw, it's edible cooked. If the stems are nice and big, you can pickle it. One great way to use it is to use it in gazpacho. So if you're a home gardener, you got all the other ingredients for the gazpacho, you probably have purslane as a weed in your garden too. Just throw the purslane leaves in there in the gazpacho and the texture works really well that way. Okay, so here's a native species. This is wild bergamot that I'm actively growing in my nursery, and a lot of people want this plant from me for the pollinators. Yes? Oh, I'm sorry, thank you. Oh, there we go. Okay, so so this one tastes like oregano. And so you might have oregano already growing in your yard, and that's fine. Lots of pollinators visit oregano flowers too, but this is one you could plant, to help the pollinators out, and then you could eat it too. Okay, now let's see if I can get this to advance. Okay, so elderberry, the common elderberry. So some people will gather these flowers and make a drink from them. There's an alcoholic version, there's a non-alcoholic version. Some people will fry these flowers in fritter batter, but I'll tell you right now, the black locust flowers make a much tastier fritter than the elderberry flowers. The other problem with picking the flowers off the plant is you're not going to get any berries there. You have to leave the flowers on the plant to get the berries. That's what I typically do. So that's what the berries look like. When they're ripe, that photo isn't upside down. The berry clusters hang upside down from the weight of the fruit. And so I understand you can get a stomach ache if you eat a lot of raw elderberries, but if you dry them first or you cook them first, you can eat all you want. So I like to make elderberry apple sauce, elderberry apple pie. It's more interesting than just plain applesauce or apple pie. Okay, so here's the spice bush I talked about before. So this is one of the native species the American colonists turned to make tea from during the Revolutionary War era when they were boycotting the British tea. They would just steep the twigs in hot water. And the spice bush berries are another edible part of the plant. And it is a spice, and it's a savory spice. So it's not, a lot of the books say it's like an allspice substitute. I have to disagree, because allspice is a sweet kind of a clovey flavor. And this is more like Szechuan peppercorns or black pepper. It's for savory things. And so what I will do is dry the berries for a couple weeks, and they lose that bright red color. they turn this color instead and they get kind of wrinkly. But once they're thoroughly dried, you can store them in a little jar in your pantry and they'll keep for years without going rancid. And then when you want to use them, you just grind up a few with a little mortar and pestle and then add that to your food. So, but having said that, these berries are really important food for migrating songbirds. They'll seek them out to fatten up for their southward migrations. And so it's very important if you're gathering spice bush berries from the wild plants to leave lots of berries on the plants to make sure that the birds get all they need that way. Yes. Oh, wow. Oh, how unlucky. How unlucky. So, of course, right, yes. With a hand lens, that's right, that's right. Yes, that's true. So, yes, and it's not the conservation district's fault or the nursery's fault because they're usually selling you a plant that's quite small and it's not blooming yet, so they can't really tell. I guess, you know, maybe if they got out an electron microscope, you know, they could tell, but, you know, but anyway, so yeah, that is a challenge when planting them. Okay, so I'm gonna tell you one other reason why you might wanna have spice bush in your yard besides eating it. Or say, oh, first I'm gonna tell you, you can propagate spice bush from the berries, and I have done this in my nursery. But don't let the berries dry out. They'll actually die and lose their viability. So you have to do two different things. To eat them, yes, dry them out. To grow plants from them, don't let them dry out. You wanna store them in those little plastic bags if you don't sow them right away, and then grow the plants that way. So here's some spice bush plants I grew, and this is something I've learned is an essential part of growing plants from seed, is this 1/2-inch mesh hardware cloth, which I throw over most of the flats I sow seed in. Even if I'm sowing teeny little seed, because the ravenous rodents wanna, it's like a kid in a sandbox. They gotta tear through it, you know, just in case there's something good in there. And they'll, you know, so what I did, I looked at these plants and I said, okay, these plants have fledged. I can pull this hardware cloth off. The next day, all these plants are uprooted because a little bit of the seed was still there and the animals smelled them. And they weren't being malicious. They just said, food, you know, let's get in there and eat it all. So that's what you can, okay. Here's the reason you want to plant spice bush or sassafras. It's the host plant for this really cool critter called the spice bush swallowtail butterfly caterpillar. So when this caterpillar is itty bitty, when it first hatches from the egg, it's only about a 1/2 inch long in the lower left corner. It looks just like bird poop, so that's an effective disguise. And then when it gets to be bigger, like 1.5 inches long, those are fake eyes in the top of the head of that caterpillar. The real eyes are further down, and it's trying to impersonate a snake. And even lower right-hand corner, when it turns into a pupa, it looks just like a dried leaf. So isn't it amazing how this organism has evolved all these ingenious disguises to avoid being eaten? Okay, so here's sweet goldenrod, Soldago odora. I've definitely found a bunch of this in Middlesex County. And I grow it from seed in my nursery. And if you look at the leaves, they don't have teeth on them, and they're also glossier and darker than most goldenrod leaves. But if you see this plant, a plant that looks like this, scrunch it up and sniff it, and you should get a really nice anise licorice aroma, which is great. So you can make tea from this plant. It's another one of the plants the colonists made tea from. Okay, wintergreen. This really common plant in conifers, and it has that oil of wintergreen flavor, which is in the leaves and also in the berries. And you can make a drink from it, but I tend, if I want to have a wintergreen flavored drink, I make it from black or yellow birch. And I do have handouts up here. So one is about making drinks from birch, and the other is about black walnuts, which is one of the things. So if you want to grab a handout, you can. And so the handout tells you how to make the drink. But there it is right there. So I have one in the cooler down there. I'm going to pull out in just a few minutes, and you get to drink the birch drink. I wanted to make that for you because a lot of this stuff I'm talking about, it's really frustrating because, oh, gee, I got to wait 5 months for that one, 6 months for that one. I know we've gotten kind of spoiled. We've gotten used to going to the store and buying anything we want any day of the year we want. And wild plants don't work that way. They often have specific seasons. But one exception to that is making birch tea from birch twigs. We can do any day of the year, black or yellow birch. So this is Middlesex County birch twig tea I made just yesterday. So, okay. And the handout tells you how to tap birch trees for sap, which, okay. And you can gather birch seeds now. when it snows. So down here hasn't really happened yet, but further north in the county, like heading up toward the New Hampshire border, where there's snow, I've seen the birch seed on the surface of the snow because the strobiles, the thing that looks like a little pine cone, is shedding the seeds all through the winter. And so you can pick the seeds off the surface of the snow. And then when you want to grow birch trees, you sow the seed in the surface of the ground. It actually needs light to germinate. And I've got a bunch of birch plants in my nursery I've grown just like that from seeds I just spread on the surface of the ground. Okay, sumac, I hope you all know this is not poison sumac, but I occasionally run into people that say, sumac, the only sumac I know is poison sumac, so that must be poison sumac. Well, no, that's what poison sumac berries look like. So very, very different. You know, they look like poison ivy berries because poison ivy and poison sumac are really close cousins. So any sumac with these tight, upright clusters of red berries, not only not poison sumac, it's edible sumac. So this is staghorn sumac. There's also wing sumac and smooth sumac. And to a lesser degree, the fragrant sumac are all sumacs with these red berries that you can make a drink from. That's mainly what you do. So, so I'll pick the fruit in the summer when the flavor is on the berries. It's pretty much washed out by this time of year. And you just throw them in a bowl of water and you rub them in the water and they're getting the flavor off the berries into the liquid. And the liquid turns this pinkish orange color. Then take that, the berries, you're done with them, take the liquid and put it through any kind of a filter like a paper towel. And then what goes through, you can drink hot or cold, sweetened or unsweetened. I typically drink it cold and sweetened like pink lemonade. And the entire time it takes from picking the fruit off the plant to drinking the drink can be as little as a half an hour. And so all this text on the left is telling you that if you do this, do not put those sumac berries in your compost pile unless you want to be picking out sumac plants at least a decade later after you make that mistake, which is what's happening to me. Like for me, I've got a nursery, I've got a place with edible native plants. I could just, any sumac grows in my, amongst my kale and broccoli, I could just move it out to my nursery. It's not a big deal, but you might get tired of doing that. Okay, so here's the fox grape. I grew up calling this the Concord grape, but the Concord grape is actually a nativar of this original wild ancestor called the fox grape, which is the one that grows wild all over Middlesex County. So I said, I have to bring something made from fox grape tonight, which I have. So this is the grape where you're minding your own business, second week of September, and all of a sudden, grapes, where's that smell coming from? Then you follow your nose to the vine, find the ripe grapes on there, and then stuff your face by the vine, which is a lot of fun. And so in a typical season, I can pretty easily fill up a basket like this from just some of the grapes from one vine. It can be a very prolific plant. And what I typically do is I make a puree from this fruit as I just throw it in a pot with some water, simmer it for a while, put it all through a food mill, and the skins or seeds are held back, and then the juice and the pulp goes through. And that puree uses raw material for making things like this yummy grape cheesecake my wife made, or what I made for you is fox grape sorbet, and it's in the cooler right over there. And it doesn't seem very December-y to serve sorbet, but I have other December-y things for you. So anyway, so that's waiting for you, just a few minutes. So this is the other species that you might encounter in Middlesex County. This is the Riverside grape, which has grapes that are edible, but they're small and they're kind of very sour, musky flavored, and not quite as good to put right into your mouth as the fox grapes. But these, you could absolutely use them to make jam or jelly. And some people say it's the grape leaves from this species are the best ones for stuffing, so better than the fox grape. So it would be in the spring or early summer that you gather them when they look like that. And the Riverside grape leaves are smooth and green on the underside. So that's what you'd use to make the stuffed grape leaves, and it's very fun to do it. Okay, so there are no poisonous species of viburnum, I'm happy to tell you. There are some that don't taste good, like maple leaf viburnum fruit doesn't taste good, arrowwood fruit doesn't taste good, but several do, like this wild raisin has nice flavored fruit. These nannyberry have nice flavored fruit. Both of these I've seen in Middlesex County. Hazelnuts, we've got two different species of hazelnuts that grow wild in Middlesex County. And I'd be lying to you if I said you haven't lived to try the flavor of a wild hazelnut, because it's the same flavor as a cultivated hazelnut or filbert. And the wild ones are smaller. You might say to yourself, I think I'll go to the store and buy a hazelnut. It's perfectly fine. But I have gathered hundreds of wild hazelnuts. And the place I do it is underneath power lines. And I don't think it's the electromagnetic radiation. I think it's just all the sun the plants get. Plus, if it's one of those wide power line corridors, that's kind of a scary place for a squirrel or a chipmunk to be because they're all exposed. You know, there's hawks and foxes and snakes and all these critters that want to see them and eat them. So the nuts tend to stay on the bushes longer. And plus, you know, all that sun helps. Yeah, so underneath power lines. And some of our more enlightened power line companies that manage the power lines, they tolerate the hazelnuts growing under the lines because they know that these bushes are never going to get taller than about 12 feet tall. So they're never going to get tall out to short out the wires. And you can see they typically grow in these very dense thickets that will inhibit the growth of the oaks and the maples and the other trees that could get tall enough to short out the wires. So yeah, so that's great. Okay. So no, I don't. Although I do see herbicides used to maintain some power lines in some places, but places like that, I don't see any evidence of any herbicide spraying. And I just see the plants, you know, basically they'll go through every once in a great while when they need to, and they'll mechanically chop the plants down that need to be chopped down. And even the hazelnuts, if they get chopped down, they'll just resprout and regrow there. So yes, like, I probably shouldn't mention names, but I'll just tell you there's some power companies that like herbicides and some that eschew the use of herbicides. So don't assume because it's a, you know, there's a power line corridor that herbicides are being used, because I don't think it is in many cases. Okay, so all oak trees produce acorns and not necessarily the same amount every year, and all acorns are edible. The question is, how bitter are they? Because almost all acorns are too bitter to enjoy raw. You have to leach the tannic acid out of them to make them palatable. And there's some debate about this amongst folks that eat acorns, but I'm of the group that think that the acorns from what's called the white oak group, which are the ones with the rounded lobes on the leaves, like these white oaks here, or swamp white oak, post oak, chestnut oak, bur oak, those are all what are called soft oak species, that they have less tannic acid levels in them than the red oak acorns. But you can eat any acorn if you just leach it long enough. Okay, Shagbark hickory, this is my #1 favorite edible wild plant. There's a whole bunch in Middlesex County. We're very fortunate to have them here. And that bark, that's not a seasonal phenomenon. The trees always look that way. And so I'm paying attention all the time if I'm in the landscape, especially some places I haven't been to for a while. And I see shagbark hickories, and I didn't know about them. I still have those old-fashioned printed state road atlases in my car, and I pull over and I get that atlas out, and I mark that spot on that atlas to say where those hickory nuts are. So hickory, the name comes from Pauca hickory, which is a traditional indigenous preparation. We make a porridge from the nuts. It's very good. This was not a good year for shagbark hickories because of how droughty it was earlier in the season. So I had a really hard time finding them. But fortunately, last year was such a good year that I've got plenty to supply me with all I need, including some I used to make something for you. You get to try in just a few minutes. So, okay, I did not make you this. This would be too hard to serve to a group like this. The maple hickory nut pie, the recipe's in my book. It's a New England version of pecan pie. Virtually everybody I feed this to say, this is even better than pecan pie. But how to crack the nuts? Yes, I've got the technique down. I forgot to bring any in from my car to show you my trick. Okay. All right. So let me just check on one thing on time-wise, okay? Because it looks like I'm going to go over 8:30. Are we going to cope with that, or do we have a janitor coming who's going to get mad? Okay. Yeah, you're free to go whenever you want. But anyway, because I got started. Okay. So what I want to do is just tell you how I get these open. So you'll see. On a typical hickory nut, they got a point to them. On each end is a point like that, right? And if you tip them on their side so that the steep side is on like this, so it's a side that they won't stay. If you just let go of them, they flop over like that. So the points go to the side, and then it's steep that way. You hit straight down on it with a hammer. And you don't pulverize it. You hit it just hard enough to send cracks to the shell. More often than not, you get big pieces out. And that's the secret to processing the hickory nuts. But I do use a hammer or a vise to get every single nut open. So there are some folks, nut fanciers, like some of these nut, associations and stuff. They're hot on the trail for coming out with a variety of hickory nut that has a thin enough shell and a uniform enough size that they think, okay, pretty soon they're going to be like pecans. We're going to mechanize them. I'm kind of ambivalent about that. I kind of like the fact that this is sort of a foraging thing. And, all right, tell you a quick story. So I'm leading a walk up on the North Shore, and there's a lot of Shagbark hickories up there in Essex County. And so I knew we were going to find some. So I brought a little jar with the hickory nuts in there, and I'm passing them around to people who are about to go on the walk. And this one woman tries them. She says, "These are great. Where can I buy them?" And I said, "You're missing the point. The point is I'm teaching about plants that you can find yourself in the landscape," stuff like that. So she goes off with her phone. She starts punching about this. And then she yells out, $30 a pound. She found some spot on eBay that, had them. So, okay, I guess that's possible. But, this is about, I just think it's fun to connect to the outdoors in this visceral, tangible way. It's my form of communion instead of wine and wafers. The outdoors is my house of worship, and Mother Nature is my goddess. My form of communion is eating nuts, berries, stuff like that. So anyway, okay. So here are 3 different cookies I make with Shagbark hickory, and the one to the right is the one I brought for you tonight, the triple maple hickory nut sandwich cookies. So there'll be some of those up here for you to try in just a few minutes. Okay, but let me just say that the jelly in the one to the left is barberry. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, you don't have to. Okay, so hazelnuts you want to pick off the plants before they hit the ground, because you wait till they hit the ground, you'll never find them. The squirrels and chipmunks will get them before you do. But hickory nuts and black walnuts, which I'll show in just a second, yeah, wait till they fall off the tree on the ground and then pick them up. Don't wait too long. This would be the time to gather hickory nuts is like the end of September into October. That's the peak time to look for them. Okay, so, all right. So, barberry jelly. What you see there in those, that would have been a nice holiday thing to make for you. Sorry you didn't get that. But I haven't made barberry jelly yet this season. I have the raw material for it, but I just haven't done it. Okay, so barberry jelly is really yummy. And that's what the barberry plants look like. There's a whole bunch of these in Middlesex County. There was an effort to eradicate these in the 1930s when, we were like WPA and CCC and stuff like that, where we were paying people to pull the barberries out because there's a belief, and it may very well be true, that this plant is an intermediate host for wheat rust. And so, New England is not a major wheat growing region, especially Middlesex County isn't. So maybe that's why there still are barberry plants, because our heart wasn't really in taking them out. Yes.
Japanese barberry. I don't know about the European ones. They're really good shelters.
Yeah, very different, very different. This is not a plant that grows in the woods. This grows in the sun. Okay, and it's very tall, and it's, even though it's called the common barberry, it's much less common than Japanese barberry. Okay, so look at those. Does that look like Japanese barberry to anybody? Okay, so you see the berries hang down in these big clusters of like a dozen berries per cluster, and Japanese barberry fruits are very, on short little stems, maybe 1 or 2, along the stem. So Japanese barberry fruit tastes horrible. This is the one that tastes good. And so I make a jelly from these or jam from these, and you can even harvest them in the middle of the winter. Okay, so here's black walnuts. You do not have to pick them off the tree. I've got a whole handout on black walnuts. We don't have to spend a lot of time with those. That's what they look like after they fall off the tree. You've got to get that outer part off. That's what's explained in the handout. And then you've got to crack these nuts open, and they are very hard. They will break most conventional nut crackers. So you can use a rock or a vise. If you've got a vise in your tool shed in your garage, that works. Here's the device I use. I got it from a company in Oklahoma. It weighs 10 pounds. It's made out of cast iron. It looks like a torture instrument from the Middle Ages and exerts a tremendous amount of torque in the nut. And finally, the nut explodes from all the pressure. But there's that little metal flange that you drop down. And, so the recipe for the baklava is in the handout that I put up here. The thing I made for you is the black walnut honey squares, and that's on the right. And it's very easy. Groundnut has an edible tuber that looks like that. It's available year-round. These definitely grow in Middlesex County. My favorite way to use them is just to slice them thinly and fry them and make groundnut chips. Jerusalem artichoke. So this is a plant that's native to the upper Midwest, but when the first European explorers to the New World arrived here, like the Jacques Cartier and Samuel de Champlain, they saw Jerusalem artichokes all over the place. How to get here? It's because our indigenous tribes traded for it. As we had quahog shells or other things that appealed to the Midwestern tribes, and we got Jerusalem artichoke tubers in trade. And so it is very likely that places where this plant is growing wild are places that are or were descended from patches that were originally established by Native Americans. And so there's the edible part, and this is available now. I mean, not that I expect anybody to get out a jackhammer and try to get through the frozen ground to get them, but when there's a thaw, during the off season, and this is both naturally occurring wild populations where they can come out being mauve or beige on the outside. These collections are made just 20 feet apart, so it's natural. Okay, so finally I'm getting to the autumn olive. That's what the flowers look like in May when they're blooming. They have a nice fragrance. The fragrance actually is like sweet pepper bush. The plants are completely unrelated. They don't bloom at the same time, just a weird coincidence. And you see that photo before, that's the fruit when it's ripe. And there's a close-up of it. You can eat autumn olive fruit raw. It will vary in flavor from bush to bush. Sometimes it's puckery and astringent, not very good at all. And sometimes it can be as good as a Thompson seedless grape, has a similar flavor. It does have seeds in it, which you can swallow or spit out. It doesn't really matter. And yeah, okay, so here's how I make that fruit leather. So I pick the fruit in the fall, and then I bring it home and throw it in a bowl of water and stir it around. And if I see any fruit that looks a little funky, like it's got a little mold on it, misshapen, whatever, that goes into the little jar in the middle, and the good fruit goes into the cooking pot. And then I add just enough water in that cooking pot to keep the fruit from scorching, like 1/3 of an inch, that's it. And then I simmer it to soften it all up, and then I put it through the food mill, the sieve with a crank on it, turn the crank, and all the seeds are held back, and then you have this frothy mauve color puree, which I pour into trays in a food dehydrator, and I let it run overnight, and it comes out in these strips, and you just peel it off and cut that into pieces, and then that's what you had. And and you can make wine from it, which I have collaborated with vintners to do that. All right, so for the next 5 minutes, last 5 minutes, I'm just going to talk about this Johnny Appleseed for native edible species thing that I'm doing. So once again, since I retired, I've set up this nursery. I've got these plants growing, worked out, arranged different groups to plant things out. So here's a few projects. Oh, so I do have a list online of everything that's edible and native to this area. So if you have any trouble finding this, let me know. I'm happy to point you toward it. So here's my stratification fridge. It's a little neater than it was when I took this photo, but this is where I store seed, to keep it cold, like it natives. Okay, so this is what my nursery looks like now. This is what I wished it looked like. And unfortunately, this is getting to be a rare event. It sure was nice when the snow would come and just uniformly blanket everything. And because it doesn't happen, I dump leaves over my plants. Like a night like tonight where it's going to get to be in the single digits, that's cold enough to kill a plant in a pot on the ground if it doesn't have any protection whatsoever. So I throw leaves over things and hope for the best. Okay, and I do start some stuff indoors for fun, and also if I have precocious seed that sprouts early and I got to get it sown. And here's a couple of pictures of plants in my nursery that I'm growing out. And you don't have to read through this list. I should probably update it. This is just some of the projects I've done. So here's some examples from Middlesex County. So this is Willards Woods, this town conservation land in Lexington, where there was a stream flowing through a culvert, and the culvert collapsed, and they needed to deal with it. They decided to just pull the culvert out and daylight the stream. And once they were finished doing that, Jordan McCarron, who managed the conservation land in Lexington at the time, said, "Russ, what should we plant here?" So I gave him a list of edible native species. And he went to his contractor and said, "Can you get these?" And the contractor was able to source a lot of them. And for the ones he couldn't get, I had them in my nursery. I just contributed them to the project. So I did a little planting plan. We got a bunch of town volunteers and the contractor crew and Jordan, and we put them in. And a lot of them are doing really well. Not all of them. Some didn't make it, but like this flowering raspberry, for example. it's really thriving. And I love it when I do a project and I put a plant in like this and I come back and I see it doing so well like this. I feel like I can read this plant's mind, and this plant is sending me a message. And the message is, Russ, thank you so much for planting me here. I'm really happy here. Okay, so here's Cambridge. There's now a whole bunch of these, what are called Miyawaki forests, these mini forests. And this is the first one in this area where they took an area of an old city dump that was capped. It was a park called Danahy Park in Cambridge. And they took about 1,000 square feet of it and they planted it up. And there's an aerial view from it. And the plants are doing really well. So here's a project at Habitat in Belmont where we took an area that was dominated by invasives and we went in with our weed wrenches and stuff, yanked them all out, and then put in the native plants. And we put cages around everything because of the deer. And this is, you just have to accept the necessity sometimes, you know, or if you're not going to do individual plants, you could do an exclosure over a whole area and then, you know, keep the deer out that way. But this is sort of like, you want the plants to make it, you got to protect them like that. So there's the group of volunteers we had with some of the plants we put in. And I've gotten like a 95% survival rate so far with these plants because of this technique. Okay, here's another project. Yes? Theoretically. I think, you know, some people will say, like, you know, I'm sure you've been to a lot of places where you see that the arborvitae have been nibbled, you know, up to about 5 or 6 feet. And then you get these pom-poms of plants growing and the deer have eaten everything below that. So, I mean, deer, you know, if they get hungry enough, they'll eat anything at any amount, at any level, you know, it just matters how desperate they are. But, you know, I at least want to give the plants a fighting chance. So I figure, okay, at least the first few feet, but I certainly, some of the places where I've used this technique, the plants get up above that level and they're just getting much, but they're not being killed. And so my hope is that they'll figure out a way to persist on that site. Here's another mini forest in Watertown at an elementary school I contributed some plants to. And so now obviously you don't have clickers here to click on all these links, and these are really long, so I wouldn't expect anybody to research this, but I'm happy to make this available. Either you contact me directly or I'll figure out how to get it to the district and share this information. If you want to, you know, learn a lot more, this would be, you know, some great websites to consult and stuff like that. All right, and with that, I'm finally done. Thank you very much. Now I did bring some copies of my book here, and it was published by a land trust, and they cost $15. I actually don't keep any of the money. I give it to the land trust because the land trust allows foraging as a permitted activity in all their properties that are open to the public. And I'm so grateful for that. I said, just keep all the money the book makes and just buy more land with it.